Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen, and enjoy my stories every day. The city lights of Milan blurred past as I sat hunched over my laptop in the dimly lit hotel room, a spreadsheet open displaying our family's bank statements. The figures were familiar territory, a routine check while I was away on business, until a particular expense caught my eye. A charge of $1,500 labeled Custom Design Emporium. Puzzled, I scrolled through past months, finding nothing similar. Why hadn't Margaret mentioned this? We always discussed large purchases. I dialed her number, the clock ticking past midnight back home. The phone rang, unanswered. Once, twice, 3 times, I hung up, unease settling in my stomach. The next few days were a haze of meetings and restless nights, punctuated by calls that went straight to voicemail. Margaret's silence was uncharacteristic. By the time my plane touched down back home, anxiety had morphed into suspicion. The taxi ride felt agonizingly slow, every stoplight a barrier to the truth. My key turned in the lock of our quiet suburban home. The silence was punctured by the faint sound of music, the kind Margaret played when she was sewing in her workshop. But as I approached, the melody was overshadowed by laughter. Unfamiliar, deep laughter. I paused at the door, heart racing. Pushing it open, I braced for the worst. Margaret, clad in an elaborate, clock-themed costume, was perched atop an antique piano, her fingers dancing over the keys while a man, dressed as a classical composer, directed her playfully. "Margaret?" My voice cracked the playful atmosphere like a whip. She spun, shock overtaking her features. "James! You're early, I thought you weren't coming home until tomorrow." Her cheeks were flushed with excitement, not guilt, a detail that barely registered. "And who is this?" I demanded, unable to keep the accusation from my tone. "This is Tom," she stammered, "from the Historical Reenactment Club. We're practicing for the town's bicentennial celebration. I was just going to call you about it." Tom, still in character, offered a courteous nod but quickly excused himself, sensing the tension. After Tom's hurried exit, the cold silence grew between us. "Why didn't you answer my calls?" I asked, voice low. "My phone's been acting up," she replied, her voice a mix of frustration and confusion. "I didn't see any missed calls. And the costume, I wanted it to be a surprise." But the seeds of doubt were already sown. Despite her plausible explanations, the image of her with another man, the missed calls, the unusual expense, it all spiraled into a dark narrative in my mind. That night, as Margaret slept, I lay awake plotting. If she could keep secrets, so could I. An eye for an eye, a heart for a heart. I'd make sure she regretted ever deceiving me, even if her only crime was a surprise gone awry. The next morning, I set my plan into motion, the details of which were cold, calculated, and utterly ruthless. As dawn crept through the blinds, casting a sliver of light across our bedroom, I watched Margaret's peaceful face. She was oblivious to the storm that brewed just across the pillow. Today would mark the beginning of her unraveling, meticulously orchestrated by the man she trusted most. After a quick shower, I stepped into the crisp morning air, my phone pressed to my ear. "Mike, I need a favor," I spoke into the receiver as soon as he answered, my voice a whisper of conspiracy. "Anything, James. What's going on?" Mike's concern was palpable, even through the static. "I need to know everything about a company, Custom Design Emporium. Can you dig up anything suspicious?" "Anything at all." "Consider it done," he replied, his tone now matching my gravity. By noon, Mike's findings were in my inbox. As I suspected, nothing outright criminal, but enough shadows to cast doubt. Perfect. I forwarded the details to Margaret's father, with whom I had fostered a solid, trusting relationship over the years. The email was brief, insinuating my concern for his daughter's sudden and secretive financial decisions. The response was swift and worried. Let's meet for lunch. Today. I'm concerned about Maggie too. Sitting across from her father, a man of stern values, I watched his brow furrow as he read the printouts. I had no idea Margaret was involved in such peculiar activities, he muttered, his voice a mix of disbelief and disappointment. We need to keep an eye on her, for her own good, I added, fueling his worry with my feigned concern. As the day unfolded, my plan took a darker turn. I called Margaret's closest friend, Lisa, under the pretense of organizing a surprise party for Margaret's upcoming birthday. She's been acting oddly, I confided. I'm really worried about her. Maybe you could talk to her. See if she's okay. Lisa, ever the protective type, agreed immediately. Of course, James. I'll call her today. By evening, the seeds of distrust were sown from all angles. Margaret was met with questioning glances and concerned whispers. Even her mother called, voice tinged with unspoken accusations. The climax of my day's work came as Margaret and I sat down for dinner. Her phone buzzed relentlessly, her gaze flitting between the screen and my face, searching for an ally in her growing isolation. I kept my expression neutral, my heart stone. Is everything okay? I asked, as she silenced her phone for the third time. She looked up, her eyes brimming with the onset of panic. It's just, everyone's been acting so strange today. My dad, Lisa, even Mom. There must be a reason, Maggie. Maybe they're seeing something you don't. My words were a velvet knife, cutting deep without seeming to pierce the surface. That night, as she fell asleep, her face streaked with tears, I turned away, the first crack in my resolve forming. What had I become? But the thought was fleeting, drowned out by the louder call of retribution. The stage was set, the players were in motion, and there was no turning back now. Margaret's life, as she knew it, was about to crumble. And I was the architect of her demise. Morning light spilled into the kitchen, casting long shadows across the floor where Margaret stood, her back to me, phone pressed to her ear. I could hear the tremble in her voice as she pleaded for understanding. Lisa, please, you have to believe me. I'm not hiding anything, Margaret's voice cracked. The phone call seemed to stretch on endlessly, each word sinking her deeper into despair. I sipped my coffee, watching her unravel, feeling a twinge of guilt that I quickly suppressed. This was necessary, I reminded myself. Necessary for justice, for retribution. As she hung up, her shoulders slumped. Turning to face me, her eyes searched mine for some sign of solace. James, why is everyone turning against me? Her voice was a whisper, fragile and breaking. I set my cup down, my face set in a mask of concern that masked the cold calculation within. Honey, maybe there's something you're not telling me. If there's a problem, you can trust me. Margaret shook her head, confusion and hurt swirling in her eyes. There's nothing, James. Just this stupid misunderstanding about the costume and the piano. Maybe it's more than that. Maybe it's about the money you've spent, I said, letting the insinuation hang heavy between us. Her face paled. You think I'm... What? James, you know everything I do. The doorbell rang, slicing through our tense conversation. I answered it to find Tom, the man from the historical reenactment club, on our doorstep, hat in hand, looking equally confused and concerned. Margaret, I heard about the troubles you've been having. I wanted to explain about the piano rehearsals, Tom began, stepping inside, oblivious to the undercurrents. Margaret nodded, wiping away a tear. Thank you, Tom, but I think it's beyond explanations now. I watched the exchange, a plan forming. Tom, perhaps you can help clear this up. Tell me, how often were these rehearsals? Were they always planned or sometimes spontaneous? Tom, caught off guard, stuttered, well, they were mostly planned. Sometimes Margaret would call an extra session if she felt unprepared. I raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. Extra sessions, you say? And these wouldn't have been on the calendar, would they? No, I suppose not always, Tom admitted, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. Margaret looked from Tom to me, realization dawning. James, what are you implying? Before I could answer, her phone buzzed again. She glanced at it, then back at us, her face draining of color. It's my dad. He wants us to come over. He says it's urgent. The drive to her parents' house was tense, each mile stretching longer than the last. Upon arrival, her father greeted us with a stern face, a stack of financial statements in his hand. Margaret, we need to talk about these expenses. And your mother and I are concerned about your secretive behavior lately. I watched silently as her family, armed with doubts I had planted, closed in around her, their questions like arrows targeting her integrity. Margaret stood, besieged on all sides, her voice barely audible over the barrage. I didn't do anything wrong. James, tell them. Tell them. All eyes turned to me, the orchestrator of her downfall, her last hope for vindication. I met her gaze, my heart faltering for a moment before the resolve hardened once more. I wish I could, Margaret. But even I am starting to wonder what's true anymore. As her world crumbled, I felt the weight of my actions. But there was no turning back. The path of retribution was a one-way street, and I had driven us both too far down it to ever return to where we had begun. The living room was thick with tension, the air almost palpable with the weight of betrayal and suspicion. Margaret's family sat in a semicircle, their expressions a mixture of concern and accusation. I stood slightly apart, the architect of this deception, watching as the final act of my orchestrated drama unfolded. Margaret, we just want the truth, her mother implored, her voice a mixture of frustration and desperation. Margaret, her eyes red and swollen from tears, shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. I've told you, there's nothing I'm hiding. James, please, tell them. Tell them everything we've planned was for the bicentennial celebration. I paused, the silence stretching between us. Then, with a calculated coldness, I spoke. Margaret, how can I defend actions that were never made clear to me? These secret rehearsals, the money, how can you explain that? Her father slammed his fist on the table, his patience worn thin. Enough. If you can't be honest with us, Margaret, then I don't know how you expect to maintain this family's trust. The room erupted into chaotic exchanges, with everyone voicing their disappointment and disbelief. Margaret's glance towards me was filled with a heartbreaking realization. The man she trusted, loved, and defended was the source of her undoing. In that moment, something within me twisted. The satisfaction I had anticipated, the sweet taste of retribution, was instead bitter, laced with an unexpected regret. But there was no turning back. As the family meeting dispersed with unresolved tensions, I pulled Margaret aside. We need to talk. Alone, I said, leading her to the now empty dining room. James, why are you doing this? What have I done to you? Her voice was a mix of anger and sorrow. I looked at her, the facade finally crumbling. I saw you, that day with Tom. It looked wrong. Everything since has been to prove my suspicions. Margaret stared at me, a dawning comprehension mixed with horror. You orchestrated this. All because of a misunderstanding. James, you've destroyed me. Yes, and I can't undo this. But I won't be part of this any longer. We're done, Margaret. My words were final, a severing blow to whatever remnants of our relationship lingered. Margaret recoiled as if struck. You've become a monster, James. A stranger driven by vindictive fantasies. I don't know you anymore. I suppose you don't, I admitted, feeling the full weight of my actions. And you never will again. Goodbye, Margaret. With that, I turned and walked out, leaving behind the shattered pieces of a life built together. As I drove away, the home we shared fading in the rearview mirror, the victory I had imagined felt hollow. The deceit and revenge had not brought clarity or satisfaction, only a profound isolation. Months passed. The divorce was swift, fueled by the revelations of my deceit. The community, once a shared space of trust and interaction, became a reminder of the havoc I had wrought. One evening, as I sat alone in a dimly lit bar, contemplating the ruins of my life, a news segment about the town's bicentennial celebration caught my attention. There on the screen was Margaret, radiant and smiling, leading the historical parade in her elaborate costume, vindicated at last in the public eye. The scene was a stark contrast to the dark path I had chosen. In seeking revenge, I had lost everything. Margaret thrived, surrounded by community and support, while I remained in the shadows, a man consumed by his own hatred and betrayal. The final revelation of my own deceit, the realization of the depth of my actions, came too late. Margaret and I were parted forever, not by her betrayal, but by mine, a truth that would haunt me for the rest of my days.